Okay, a big welcome to everybody here. It's a great Sunday to be at church. We've got the church picnic after church today, so that's at Fircrest Park. You can just kind of follow all the cars. Going that way, you'll probably end up at the right place. Hopefully, I see that Chris Potts actually already has his trunks on for his turn in the dunk tank, so this is going to be a real ripper this afternoon. But even more so, it's a great Sunday because we get to spend the next, 45 minutes or so together in the Scriptures, sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to his teaching. That's really the main point of today's passage in Luke, which is Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. It is about the priority of listening to Jesus. The priority of that, of hearing him, of knowing what it is that Jesus says in the words of Scripture and letting his teaching, his voice become the primary shaping agent of your thoughts, of your values, of your priorities, your desires, your serving. All of that starts with hearing Jesus. So don't just do something, sit there. That is the title of this sermon. I didn't come up with that. Bruce did something a couple of weeks ago that he has never done in my entire our 15 years of sharing a pulpit together. He walked into my office, slapped a sticky note down on my coffee table and said, "Nate, here's the title for your sermon in 2 weeks. Don't just do something, sit there." So, how apt that is, right? We start with sitting in the Christian life. We start with listening to Jesus. This is our priority as disciples, as followers, this is not a new theme in Luke's gospel, right? We've seen this idea come up several times in the story so far. I think, Jesus' first public sermon, he says, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear. This is my beloved Son, hear him," is what we hear from that thunderous, voice of God the Father on the Mount of Transfiguration in the chapter right before. There's really the climax of that scene is all about hearing Jesus. And then even the wind and the waves tell us to do this. When Jesus is in the boat with his disciples and he speaks, and what do the wind and the waves do? They listen to Jesus. They hear him and they obey. But now, in this fascinating little section right here, we hear this call once again, not in front of this big, massive crowd that is gathered around Jesus to hear him teach, not on top of that mountain where his clothes are like lightning and everything's shaking and there's thunder and all of that, but in the living room of a modest Judean home to a frustrated, distracted, overwhelmed woman. "Martha, Martha," Jesus says. So what makes our story today so fascinating and really so powerful, I think, and it resonates with us forever, is that even though this is so compressed, it's just, look at your handout there. It's just 5 little verses. This is just a tiny little paragraph in Luke's gospel. But the reason it's so powerful is this is so relatable. It's so easy to put modern clothes on this story right here, right? We see ourselves in this. How can't you? Like the interaction of the sisters, Martha's frustration, her complaint. Now, it's like human nature has changed very little in 2 millennia is what we're going to see in this right here. And we're also going to see how these words of Jesus to this fragmented woman who is pulled in so many different directions are just as unexpected. They are just as subversive, just as insightful, just as needed for us today. Each one of us right here, maybe even more so. We live in an era in which just human experience for everybody, Christian or non-Christian, is more fragmented than ever before. Distracted is how Martha is introduced in the narration. Anxious and troubled about many things is how Jesus describes kind of her internal state. Anxious, troubled, distracted. Do those words resonate with anyone here? Again, we live in this era in which there are more things pulling on us, pulling on our time, pulling on our attention, our values, our priorities than at any other point in human history, arguably. The distracted generation is how sociologists have described those who have grown up kind of in this time period and known nothing different. So it's no surprise that we can see both if we look at kind of sociological charts and graphs, but also in our own souls, if we look honestly in the mirror, both a rise in anxiety and a decline in the quality of interpersonal relationships that are directly related to the level of distraction in our lives, the level of fragmentation, the degree to which our internal self is disintegrated, pulled in many different ways and places. In this passage, Jesus calls us to something better. Quite literally, the better portion, the best portion, the good thing, which really can reorient all of our other priorities and lead to a life of stability, of groundedness, of unification, of purpose, of permanence. This will not be taken away, Jesus says. And it starts with sitting at his feet. It starts with listening. So that's what we're going to do this morning. Okay, we're going to take this story one verse at a time. We're going to go through this story, and then we're going to end with some instruction for all of us. 5 lessons for us to consider as we think about what this story might mean for us today. So we'll start with verse 38. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. So it's a positive introduction for Martha that we start with in this little story. Jesus and his disciples, they're traveling, we're reminded, right? So we're still at the beginning of this large, journey to Jerusalem section that takes up the whole middle of Luke's gospel, chapter 10 all the way to chapter 19, the largest section in the book. So they're traveling now, and they need a place to stay and to eat, and Martha opens up her home, right? She welcomed Jesus. That's a positive, specific term for hospitality in this context, and this is commendable. Remember, we just saw the opposite of this right before this in Luke's gospel. Do you remember this? When Jesus enters into a Samaritan village, he's looking for a place to stay and to eat, and what happens? He's rejected. They do not welcome him, and that's when 2 of the disciples want to call down fire and all of that, right? Well, here, this is the absolute reverse. Jesus is welcomed. Go Martha is kind of what we're thinking right here. What could possibly go wrong? Verse 39. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. Here's where the story takes its first surprising turn of many. Pretty much every verse successively in this has some sort of reversal that would make the original readers go like, wait, what? And this first one maybe is the biggest of those, right? Now, this is a turn that for these people at this time would have been even just as unexpected and even subversive as the story of the Good Samaritan right before this. So Bruce brought this out well last week. If you missed Bruce's sermon on that, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to it. How even that term, Good Samaritan, for these people at that time would have been seen as like an oxymoron. Right? Just absurd given the tension between those two people groups, between Jewish people and those who live in Samaria. Like Good Samaritan? No such thing, right? From a Jewish perspective. So then what's happening here in this very next story, so we go from that story where you're like, whoa, what is going on here? Jesus is doing that same sort of thing of redrawing lines and subverting expectations right here in regard to what it means to be a disciple, and more specifically, who can be a disciple of Jesus. What's surprising about this verse is that Mary is presented as a disciple right here. Not one of the 12, like not, disciple with a capital D, but that larger group of followers and disciples and learners, which is presented throughout Luke as, following Jesus and learning from him and listening to him as his teaching. Mary is a disciple. This is what it meant to sit at someone's feet and listen to their teaching. We sometimes get the wrong idea about this, that this is some sort of, adoring posture that Mary is assuming right here. Like she's just, oh man, she's entranced with Jesus. So she's just like sitting at his feet the way that maybe you would at the feet of a rock star and just gaze up at them kind of and just starstruck. Like maybe we even think of this as a distinctively feminine posture, right? Is how this might read to us. Well, I'll tell you what, it would read exactly the opposite to someone from this time period. To sit at a rabbi's feet was a man's place. To sit at a rabbi's feet meant that you were one of his disciples, aka one of his followers, one of his students, and that you were absorbing his teaching, you were asking questions, and you were learning so as to be able to pass this along to others. The Apostle Paul, in fact, uses this exact same phrase, this exact same image to describe his training under the great rabbi Gamaliel. I was educated at the feet of Gamaliel, he says in Acts 22:3. Again, not because Paul said he was sitting there in some entranced or adoring posture, but because he was there to learn and be his disciples as a serious student according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, as he puts it right there. So this was serious learning time when you were sitting at somebody's feet. And that's what we see from Mary right here. A female disciple. Just as much an oxymoron in this time period as a good Samaritan. The female disciple, who ever heard of that? So what Mary is doing here, it's not just subversive religiously, but culturally. So homes at this time were divided into male spaces and female spaces. The front space was for the men, where they would sit and eat, and the only time a woman would go in there was for service, when it was a kind of a public gathering like this. The back room was for the women, where the food was prepared and the women ate. So we still have this sort of thing in places today. I used to work at a country club as a waiter, where we had this area toward the back, which was known as the men's lounge. And in that area, there was a sign over the door that said men's lounge, and women were not permitted in there. I'm not joking. This is only 10 years ago. I worked there for like 5 years. It was still there when I left. I don't know if it's still there but I mean, this was the idea. It was pretty much the same thing in first century Jewish culture, unless, again, they were serving or cleaning up. There was also an outside area where men and women would sometimes mix, like where the kids were playing out toward the street, or other than that. But otherwise, this was a male space. So this here would be like if you were reading a Jane Austen novel, and one of the women followed the men into the library for cigars and brandy, and sat down with them. Or if one of you ladies here just drove up to Seattle to that country club and walked in through the restaurant back to the men's lounge and sat down and ordered a drink, right? The audacity of that. The scandal. Obviously, Jesus is not going to put up with this, right? Verse 40. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." We're meant to empathize with Martha as readers at this point in the story. Her question in the Greek, it's written in a way that expects a positive response, like, of course Mary should be helping Martha. It's a rhetorical question. Of course she shouldn't be leaving her sister to do all the work. Not only is it weird for Mary to be invading the male space and sitting there like a male disciple, but she's left her poor, welcoming sister, the one who did the right thing and welcomed Jesus, in the women's space to do all of the food prep by herself. So, tell her to get in there and start pressing some olives, right? Or gutting a fish, or whatever she ought to be doing at this time. Martha's wilting in there. Again, this is so relatable. I was talking to my mom about this, but we think about, like, who among us doesn't have a sibling who sometimes is a bit of a slacker when it comes to family stuff, Like, I know some of you have brothers and sisters who are even in this room. Like, the weird thing is I see all of you nodding, so I don't know what to make about that. But except that we've all been there with Martha, right? Again, I'll try to keep this as anonymous as possible, but I remember a time when my two sisters had such a sharp dispute about who needed to do what when it came to cleaning their shared bedroom, that one sister came home from school to find all of her misplaced belongings, anything that had been not in the right spot, scattered around the front yard because the other sister had thrown them from the second-story window. Okay? So again, this is understandable. We feel this, and I think, we are ready to take Martha's side in this as readers. The question is, the suspense right here is Jesus? How is he going to respond? We've kind of got two strikes against Mary here, right? She's breaking social norms. She's breaking religious norms. She's also kind of stepping on her sister's toes and all this. What is Jesus going to say? Verse 41. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. So just one very quick, this is kind of a bonus lesson from all of us that we can take away here. Be very careful if you ever come to Jesus with a complaint about another person, right? He is going to turn the tables on you. This is almost always how it works. We see this in the way he responds to the guy who comes up and says, Jesus, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. We see this when the disciples are arguing about who is the greatest. We see this in the parable of the prodigal son when the elder brother, who, by the way, he has essentially the same complaint as Mary here, which is it's not fair among siblings. You go to Jesus with the behavior about someone else, and guess what he's going to do? Guess what he's going to tell? Guess where he's going to tell you to look? It's at your own heart, your own misdirected attitudes and assumptions. This is what Jesus does because he loves you. Every single one of us here spends far too much time and emotional energy worrying about the behavior of other people. We do. That's probably, I imagine when we get to eternity and have some regrets, maybe, that probably would be where we see we wasted some of the most time and effort and frustration, is worrying about other people's behavior. So Martha's example right here should really make us pump the brakes on that kind of attitude for three quick reasons. One, Martha demonstrates that just because we're sure that we're right doesn't mean we are right. We are fallible judges working with limited information and a limited perspective. We have to always keep that in mind, even when we're on a righteous crusade of some sort. Two, Martha proves that our own selfishness makes us biased in our own favor. Scholars are quick to note the abundance of me language in her complaint to Jesus right there. There's 3 times that she uses the personal pronoun in this. My, me, right? And then 3, Jesus just tells us straight up not to do this. Don't waste your time. In fact, it's sinful. Matthew 7, judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. There's that turning of the tables, right? And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that's in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, or in this case, sister, let me take the speck out of your own eye when there is a log in your own eye? Because otherwise, when Martha walked in that room with that huge log swinging out of her eye, she could have clotheslined her. It could have been ugly. This is what Jesus exposes right here in this reply. And what we're going to do, kind of for our instruction part of this, is we are going to look at this reply and reflect on this as a springboard of instruction for all of us. Okay, five lessons here. Lesson number 1, worth repeating again, it's that Jesus welcomes women as disciples. We spent some time on this idea already. I'm repeating this here because this is important, that Jesus welcomes women enthusiastically to be his students, his followers, his representatives, full inclusion. Notice how Jesus makes this just crystal clear in this reply to Martha, right? But by sitting at his feet, Mary is doing the best thing possible for a woman, for anyone. He's not just like permitting her to do this. He doesn't say, okay, Martha, just this one time. Okay, she can do this. No, he is commending her for doing this. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her, meaning possibly that her decision to follow Jesus and listen to him has eternal value. I think there's that aspect to this. But there's also a kind of a correction in that part at the end there for Martha. You're not taking this away from her. This isn't going to be taken away from her right now. No one is. You're not going to pull her back into the kitchen where she could be, when she could be sitting at my feet, because she belongs here. Women belong here, as does any woman or any man who wants to hear my voice and learn from me. A woman's place is at the feet of Jesus, sitting alongside her brothers, listening, learning, growing, preparing to pass that instruction on to others. I mean, there's many scholars who just see this right here as really the main point of this story. It's unique because Luke is the only gospel writer who records this story. And as we know, This was a special point of emphasis in Luke. Some call Luke the women's gospel because of this, that this is the gospel for the poor and the women, because over and over, Luke is highlighting how Jesus goes to those people and includes them fully in this. I mean, and think about what we see in the rest of the New Testament. I mean, this would have been mind-blowing in this culture, in this context, where women truly were not seen as equal with men. We take this for granted now in the modern West, but the reason we take this for granted is because we're downstream of the teaching of Jesus Christ. This was radical in this time and place. And over in the New Testament, we see so many examples of strong, godly women who took their discipleship to Jesus seriously and were commended for it, and they're highlighted in Scripture. I think of Phoebe, who's called a deaconess and was responsible for delivering the letter of Romans to the church in Rome. I mean, a huge responsibility in that. We've got Priscilla, who Paul calls a fellow worker and is almost always listed ahead of her husband. When he talks about her, it's always Priscilla and Aquila, right? You've got Lydia, you've got Chloe, who probably delivered 1 Corinthians, another significant thing there. Joanna and Susanna, who Luke already highlighted, were these prominent women who were actually traveling with Jesus and supporting the ministry of Jesus out of their means. Think about that for a while. They were supporting Jesus. That's pretty radical right there. And then we've got one of my personal favorites is Junia, who we named our fourth child, our daughter, after we named her Junia. Someone at our neighborhood block party last night was asking me, why did you name her Junia? And I was just so juiced to be able to tell her, well, you know what? She's in the Bible. And Paul says that she was one of these people who was sent out by the church for the work of ministry, along with her husband. And I'm just so happy to be able to tell, my daughter that this is how Jesus thinks about women. This is your purpose. This is your purpose, to learn about Jesus and to be one of his workers alongside your brothers. What a blessing that is. In fact, I was so excited today because we have our sister Karen Dubois here. I didn't know she was going to be here, but I gave her a hug. She's in the back there. And guess what? Karen was sent out by this church 36 years ago, the year I was born, in fact. So we kind of crossed paths. She left, I came in. But she's been serving as one sent out by our church in the country of Turkey. I think I said that right. Turkey? Okay, close enough. Turkey, we say it if we're real, state Americans here. But she's been there faithfully serving as one sent out by us, just like Junia. I just think it's so cool. So we highlight this here because it's important. And thank the Lord for women like Karen, women like so many other women in this church who are godly women, who are strong in the scriptures and just models of this same spirit that we see right here. Lesson number 2, serving is not bad. Now, that seems weird that I even have to say this, right? But some have gone overboard in interpreting this story right here, so it's worth making the point. This is not ultimately a story about serving versus listening, with the point being that, service is bad and listening is good, so that we should all just throw everything away and pursue a life of contemplation, where we're just sitting on some mountain up there just with our Bibles and never doing anything for other people. All right, some people have gone overboard with this one, so we need to think carefully about that. And really what to me is the big balancer in this is when we read this story in context. What came right before this? What Bruce preached on last week? The story of the Good Samaritan, right? Well, boy, if you just read that story in isolation and went overboard with it, you'd come to the exact opposite conclusion, right? That the Christian life, it's all about serving in action. Don't be like those two bad guys in the story, the priest and the Levite, who were going off to the temple, most likely traveling on that road to Jerusalem to go worship and pray and do the work there. They're the bad guys. We need to be like the Good Samaritan who actually stops and binds up the guy's wounds. So you could read that and think, no, the life of contemplation and worship is bad. We need to be all about service. So which story is right? Both are. This is why they're together in our Bible. Serving and listening are not in competition. In fact, they're complementary. This is what we see in the teaching of Jesus. Remember, these stories come right after the announcement of the 2 great commandments. Do you remember this? You shall love the Lord your God with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. So you got the vertical, loving God, and the horizontal, loving other people. So this is the importance of knowing God and worshiping God and listening to God, coupled with the importance of serving your neighbor. So these are both vital aspects of the Christian life, is the idea we need. These stories, especially as we see them in succession as a pair, they illustrate the necessity of both of these priorities in the lives of those who are followers of Jesus. So just think for a second, what if you had service without listening? If you just had the second commandment without the first one? Well, it's probably you would burn out for one thing. You don't have the resources to keep doing that. Or even worse, you could keep serving, but with the wrong attitude and the wrong sort of goals. And that could be just as bad, especially for the people you're serving. Likewise, if you are one who is really listening, what is that going to do? That is going to propel you to service and sustain your service, because that's what Jesus tells you to do. So it's not one or the other. It is both. That's what we see here in Mary and Martha. But what we also see here is that logically and by necessity, listening must come first. Listening is prior. There are two great commandments, but there is an order to them, right? And a priority. And everything starts with the vertical. So then lesson number 3, we must protect the priority of listening to Jesus. So what do I mean by that? Well, of all the parts of this story, maybe the one that's the most relatable to many of us is how Martha was introduced by Luke in the narration when he says, "But Martha was distracted with much serving." Again, her problem isn't that she was serving. He doesn't say that. That's commendable. It's how she went about that serving in terms of attitude and priorities. That word distracted literally means pulled away, pulled apart, even like she's scattered, she's disoriented, she's disintegrated. Again, what better descriptor could there be for so many of us in modern life? Scattered, pulled, distracted. By what? I mean, that's the question I want us to consider here with some real introspection. Like, if Jesus was speaking to you in this instant right here, what might he say? Susan, you are distracted and anxious by much. What? Nate, you are distracted and troubled by much. What would he put in that blank for me, right? Or for you? What pulls you away? Is it much service? Like Martha, that's possible. We got a lot of wonderful servers in this church. That's awesome. Or is it something else? I think, as I reflected on this, I think for many of us, we could probably start with, the devices in our pockets, right? Nate, you are anxious and distracted by much scrolling, right? Or how about scheduling? Does anyone else feel the fatigue of that? How the calendar just fills up. And before you know it, you're just off doing thing after thing after thing after thing. And if someone was like, hey, Nate, there's this really great Christian conference coming up in a couple of weeks that I think we could both really benefit from and be better as husbands and fathers, and just if we took that time to go away and listen to some teaching, I'd be like, yeah, I don't even need to look at my calendar. There's no chance. We're booked till Valentine's Day. And maybe, do you want me to pencil something in for 2026 or something like that? Can anyone relate to that feeling? That's not good. No, a prominent pastor once asked the Christian philosopher Dallas Willard what he needed to do to grow spiritually. And Willard paused and he said, "You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life." So the pastor was like, "Oh yeah, that's good." And he wrote that down, and then he said, "Okay, what's next?" And Dallas Willard said, "No, that's it. Like come back to me after you've done it." I'm reminded of the words of another prominent pastor, Eugene Peterson. It's along these same lines, and he writes, "It was a favorite theme of C.S. Lewis that only lazy people work hard. By lazily abdicating the essential work of deciding and directing, establishing values, and setting goals, other people do it for us. And then we find ourselves frantically at the last minute trying to satisfy a half dozen different demands on our time, none of which is essential to our vocation, to stave off the disaster of disappointing someone. But If I vainly crowd my day with conspicuous activity or let others fill my day with imperious demands, I don't have time to do my proper work, the work to which I've been called. How can I lead people into the quiet place beside the still waters if I am in perpetual motion? How can I persuade a person to live by faith and not by works if I have to juggle my schedule constantly to make everything fit into place? I'll tell you what, that phrase right there arrested me the first time that I read it, and it still does. Not just thinking about being a pastor, but being a parent. How can I lead people into the quiet place beside the still waters if I am in perpetual motion? How can I expect to lead my kids toward a lifetime of focused devotion on Jesus when they see my wife and me just scrambling to fit a million other things in? You know, they're watching us. They are learning what we see as valuable, what is most important. They see us living these priorities and forming these values every time it is that, Shauna and I write something on our family calendar. So what am I modeling for them? What do they see as most important when they see as how we spend our time and what we prioritize? We as Christians, we love to talk about being countercultural, and we often think about how God has called us to live very differently than a lot of people around us in regard to like our morality or how we think about sexuality or politics or whatever it is, some of these kind of big things that we think about a lot. I'll tell you what, there may be no more distinctive way for us to live in a radically countercultural manner right now, adjacent to our neighbors, than to change how we relate to our phones and our calendars. You want to be really different, that's the way to do it, right? Remember, Mary was breaking social norms right here. She was prioritizing listening to Jesus rather than what was expected of her in her culture and what everyone else around her was doing, even her own sister, right? And no doubt Mary knew how Martha would react to this. She had lived with Martha all her life. She had been there when Martha threw all her clothes out the window in 8th grade, right? But she was willing to protect this priority of listening to Jesus, even if that meant transgressing social norms. So for us today, what are you willing to do practically to reduce the distracting power of your phone? Have you considered that lately? Are there apps that you would be willing to delete? Are there apps you would not be willing to delete? Are there guardrails and limits that you need to establish to keep your phone from sapping time or sapping attention or fragmenting you in a way that's not healthy? Then with our calendars, are there commitments that we need to delete? Are there obligations that we feel socially or culturally are kind of pulling us in different directions, maybe away from the one thing that's necessary, the one thing that won't be taken away? It's a wonderful time to evaluate this before the fall because that's really when things ramp up for a lot of people, right? Things kind of get kicked back into gear. It's a good time to evaluate. Do we need to do all of these things? What is most important? I should say we also need to be careful about not judging others in this. I was thinking about sharing right here this rule that my parents had in regard for us kids. There were 4 of us Corley kids, and they had this rule in regard to us and activities that I think was really wise and did a good job guarding our time and priorities. I was going to share it here, but I'm not going to for the sake of avoiding legalism, because it's really easy to lay down a rule about something like this, and then all of us start to feel guilty if we're not doing that sort of thing. So, think of the example of Jesus right here, right? He doesn't lay down a rule for Martha and say, this much serving is okay, this much isn't. Instead, what does he do? He goes straight for the heart. He goes straight for the attitudes that are behind all that. So if you want to know that rule, you got to talk to my parents, okay? And I'm sure they'd be happy to share it to you. But for now, we are going to go where Jesus was, which is to the heart. Lesson number 4. The problem is in our hearts. Did you notice how Jesus starts there when he replies to Martha? He doesn't say, stop serving and sit down, which I assume could have gotten some results. He diagnoses her heart. I love this. He says, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. There's some debate about what the many things versus the one thing are there that Jesus refers to. Probably this is the majority interpretation that I'm very comfortable with, that the many things have to do with these demands of hospitality as well as the social pressure and practical pressure kind of to perform that would go along with that. So Martha is stressed about pulling off this great dinner with all these people, and a prominent guest wants it to work out well. And then the one thing would be the example of Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to him. Okay, I think that works. Interestingly, my mom gave me a theory on Friday that I had never heard before. I consulted a whole bunch of commentaries and scholars about this, and none of them had this. Maybe because they were all men that I was reading. But my mom thinks that both of these are related to hospitality. I was like, what? She said that the many things there could be all of the different things that Martha is trying to put together for this meal, but Jesus is saying, you don't need to have a huge spread for us. Just one thing is enough. You get it? And I was like, that's interesting. I told my mom she should submit a scholarly paper on this and just rock the world of biblical scholarship. But we'll see. Regardless of how you take the many versus the one thing, the focus of Jesus here, it's not on Martha's hospitality and how she's performing at that, nor is it on her complaint, but where he goes specifically is right to her heart. You are anxious and troubled, he says. Again, distracted is how she was introduced in the narration just before us. So essentially, like pretty much everything else Jesus diagnoses in this gospel, the problem is not out there with the pressure of all this stuff. No, for Martha, for all of us, the problem is in here. It's in our hearts, which is why I should say, just throwing away your phone isn't going to fix anything. You hear that? You read history, or just talk to someone here who has some gray hair and lived through the 80s, People were anxious and distracted well before the iPhone, right? I think of that quote there. This kind of another thing that arrested me when I read it about living in perpetual motion was when I noticed when it was written, and it's 1993. 1993, Eugene Peterson said that. I know we got the high schoolers in here and some of the middle schoolers this summer, so you teens may not know this, but computers were the size of an ice chest in 1993. And to get on the internet, you had to hook them up to this apparatus with tubes and pipes and this crank on the side, and you did the crank, and the steam came bursting out, and finally when the thing is it's idling like a diesel engine, and you can get on the internet, and all you can do is play Minesweeper. That's it. There was no other purpose for those machines, as I recall them in the 90s. You could play Minesweeper, but still, even in 1993, distraction was a problem. Overscheduling and busyness and disorientation from Jesus were a problem. They were a problem in the Victorian era. They were a problem in the Middle Ages. They were a problem in the biblical era, right? And they always will be in some form or another because, again, the problem is in the heart, which means, again, this is why I didn't set up a burn barrel up here, ask them to turn on the music, and we all come dropping our phones in one at a time, as dramatic as that would be, right? It's also not the solution to go move to some, off-the-grid commune where your biggest activities week to week, if you're flipping through the calendar, you got Thursday I've got corn husking, Friday I've got candle dipping. It's a pretty full week. No, even in those communities, there's distraction. Even in those communities, there is, restlessness of the spirit because the problem is in here, which means, as we look at this, we don't just need Jesus to teach us, we need Jesus to rescue us. We don't just need Jesus to fill our head with the right ideas and get the wrong ideas out of there. We need Jesus to fix our hearts by the power of his Spirit, and that's where this story is going. It's going to a cross, it's going to a tomb, it's going to the ascension, it's going to the outpouring of his Spirit, an outpouring of God's mercy from Jesus to sinners, which we see previewed even right here. I love this. Lesson number 5. It's the tender patience of Jesus, even with misguided, surly sinners. So we've spent a lot of time looking at Mary in this. That's kind of our example. We've spent a lot of time looking at Martha analyzing her and her response and all that. This story is not about either of those women, ultimately. It is about the person in the middle teaching, who welcomes Mary as his disciple, which is radical, who may be even more radical, embraces Martha, even after her response right there with tender words of correction, who would be very, very happy to welcome any of you. I was listening to an interview last week with a young man who was raised in Indonesia, in Jakarta, as an atheist, and he was so firm in his atheism up until his senior year of high school, where he began to see really good reasons for God and to think, wow, maybe there is good rational reasons to believe that God exists and has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. But something stopped him for a very long time, and it was this thought: God wouldn't want me. Even if God is real, I know, as a matter of fact, that I am a sinner. I know what kind of life I have lived. I know what kind of life I'm living right now. What does it matter if God exists or not? He doesn't want me. This story right here, and along with a litany of others in the Gospel of Luke, prove otherwise. Just look at Martha's entrance again in this story, right? She is coming in hot and hostile. Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. Literally, speak to her. This is an imperative command that jumps out in the original. Speak. Speak, Jesus. So she is telling Jesus what to do. She is giving a command to Jesus. It's not often we see that in the Gospels, right? And then she does this right on the heels of questioning his character. Did you notice that right there, how she begins? Do you not care? She says. It's not, did you not perhaps notice, or do you not have the authority? No, do you not care? She is questioning Jesus' heart. She's questioning his concern for her, his love. I'll tell you what, if you've read what's come before this in Luke and know to whom Martha is speaking all of these words, right? And what we have learned about the identity of Jesus, we could very well expect Jesus to blast Martha right here, right? This is the Messiah who was just unveiled in all of his glory on the Mount of Transfiguration. This is the one that when he speaks to demons, they just go running, who raises the dead with a word, who calms the storm with his voice. Like, you don't talk to God incarnate this way and get away with it, right? There are people watching. At the very least, she deserves a sharp rebuke in public to correct the record. But instead, Jesus says this: Martha, Martha. That's her personal name, right? Not woman, not some other designator. He doesn't just turn away from her and say something broad and cryptic to the crowd. No, he looks right at her and repeats her name twice: Martha, Martha, which every scholar will tell you is a sign of tenderness. It's a sign of interpersonal concern. He is saying, Martha, Martha, I see you. I hear you. I know you. I understand what's going on in your heart. Now let me correct you and point you to something better. This is love that we see from Jesus right here. This is love that is tender to people who are hostile. This is love that is patient with those who don't get it. This is love that is willing to overlook even when this person speaks to you with far less respect than you actually deserve. And then, beautifully, this is love enough to help her and correct her. Give her what she really needs. So I think about this and say, who wouldn't want to make this kind of person the dominant voice in your life? Who wouldn't want to hear and seek after and learn and listen to and obey the words of someone who knows you completely, down to the number of hairs on your head and even every secret thought and attitude and the sins in your heart that you may even be blind to this moment, yet he loves you anyway and wants to help you, even to the point of taking your sins upon himself, paying the price on the cross, so then you can sit at his feet in the presence of the Lord without any shame, nothing between you, so you can just listen and learn and be equipped to go be his representative. This is the one who says, listen to me. What a friend, what a Savior. Let's worship him together. Father, we thank you so much for how you have revealed your heart to us through Jesus Christ. And we don't have to wonder if you would accept us. We can look at Jesus and know, yes, you do. Not because we're so good, not because of our great track record, but really despite that, Lord, you have made a way for us to become clean, to be washed of our sins, to enter into your presence boldly. Thank you for the revelation that you've given through your Son, Jesus. Thank you for your Spirit who has inspired the words of Scripture. May we listen well. May we be shaped. May we be formed to be good and honorable representatives of you to a world who needs you so badly. We ask this humbly in the name of Jesus Christ, our friend, our Lord. Amen.